Welcome to this panel on curating in conversation. We're so glad you can join us this evening. My name is Lauren McLaughlin, and I'm joining in from Seattle, where I live and work on the lands of the Coast Salish peoples, the Duwamish, the Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. I acknowledge the ancestors from these homelands and shared waters and the continuous ongoing stewardship of the Coast Salish people who live and thrive here today. I want to let everybody know that this webinar is being recorded. We'll start with some comments and conversations with the panelists and among the panelists, and then we'll also have some time for Q&A. Please post questions anytime you have them as they occur to you in the Q&A section, and we will be able to turn to them a bit later. We also have Bridget Johnson here, and she is going to be backstage and monitoring the Q&A. So if you have any technical challenges, you can feel free to post them to her as well. We know that in Seattle, it's been a bit windy today. There are power outages around the city. So if one of us, if you lose us or if you're lost as a viewer, we just may have some gaps in connection, but we'll hope that you can all rejoin, and we will endeavor to rejoin too. So just to get started with some introductions, I'm Lauren McLaughlin. As I mentioned, I'm editor-in-chief of the University of Washington Press, where we recently published this book, which is Unsettling Native Art Histories on the Northwest Coast. It's edited by Kathryn Bunn-Marucuse, who's here with us today, and Aldona Janitis. We have three panelists today. We have Katie, as I mentioned, and we also have Neel and Evelyn Vanderhoop. And I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves and say a little bit about where they're coming from, as well as their connections to the Burke Museum and to the volume. So do you want to get us started, Evelyn?
Hi, I'm Evelyn Vanderhoop. Kajuth is my Haida name. I live up here in Masset, British Columbia. I'm a weaver of the chief's robes. They were traditionally mountain goat robes. And I do a lot of research in the origins of the patterns and just tracking down the history of these robes. And I've been doing all this research for decades now. So when I've been asked to write some of my research and some of my exciting things that I found throughout my years of research, I really appreciate that I can write these essays and contribute to the ongoing understanding of the Northwest Coast art. I am a fan of the Burke Museum, and I have been for a really long time. The first time that I was on my first Naheen robe, I came to the main face and the eyes, and I thought, this is an exciting place. And I want to share this. So I picked up the phone and I talked to Robin Wright, and she said, sure, come on over, bring your loom. And I was homeschooling too. So I had my little son running around. The Burke has a wonderful program for education. So the education department took my son and made him smarter. And then I sat and demonstrated the robe that I was doing, and they were just wonderful. They sent a reporter from the Seattle PI to come and interview me, and so I was there for about a week. My first robe, years and years ago. So and now I'm a board member for the Bill Holm study of the Northwest Coast. I also, before that, was a recipient of that committee, of that program, and was able to go and study in the collection. And so the Burke has always been good to me, and I try to be good to it.
Thank you. Luann, may I ask you to go next?
Sure. Dela Castella, Ikyatwagatlan, Yayutlan Lacha Mama Lilakla to Wakwagios, La Umkan, a Dela Castla Hat La Quangan, the Ehis Galagachans, and Skache La Hoja Witnaquisas. In my language of Kwakwa, I've introduced myself by one of my names, which is Ikyatwaga. I'm from the Mama Lilakla and the Kwagyoth of the Kwakwa people, originally from Alert Bay. And I've also acknowledged and thanked the Lekwungen people, known in English as the Songhees and the Esquimalt people, for always making me feel so welcome in the land of their ancestors. I've lived in Victoria for over 50 years now, and I love that Alert Bay is my home. I get to go back and visit pretty much throughout the year, every year. And throughout some of my visits, especially going back to the Utmista Cultural Center, I started to get really interested in museums and collections. And I found out about the Burke, I don't even know how many years ago. I think when my aunt was studying at the University of Washington, and found out that there was a puppet that my grandmother carved and was in the collection. So I really wanted to see it. But I also, like Evelyn, applied for the Artist Researcher Grant out of the Bill Holm Center and got an opportunity to go and study button blankets, but also some of the carved pieces and jewelry. So I've been a really big fan also of the Burke for many years, and made really good friends with Katie and with all of the crew there at the Burke and in the University of Washington. So it's always a pleasure for me to join in. Whenever Katie calls, the answer is yes, unless I'm painting. I'm also a practicing artist, and started in textiles, but have been dabbling in a lot of different things, and most recently in digital design. Lots of this is inspired by my grandmother's work. And in the daytime, I work at the Royal BC Museum as the head of the Indigenous Collections and Repatriation Department. Thanks.
Thank you. Katie?
Okay, well, I'm Kathryn Bunn-Marucuse, and I am a settler scholar. I live in Coast Salish territory here in Seattle as an uninvited guest, and I originally came from Kanaka Maoli territory in Honolulu, but I've lived here for a long time, and I am very grateful to be here. And I work as the curator of Northwest Native Art at the Burke Museum and the director of the Bill Holm Center for the Study of Northwest Native Art. And I'm an assistant professor in the art history department. So that's a lot of bits and pieces, but it really is a wonderful chance to work with students and with artists and with the collections. And so it all comes together really well. And I'm so appreciative of Luann and Evelyn to say a little bit about their long history with the Burke. I started my first graduate student projects there quite a long time ago in the 90s. And I learned a lot from the people who Evelyn and Luann have mentioned, from Robin Wright, our former curator, and from Bill Holm, who was the curator before that, really about the kinds of relationships that the two of them are talking about the ways that individuals in museums, and then hopefully institutions following the lead of those individuals, are responsible not only to their collections, but to all of the current communities whose collections and whose cultural heritage we take care of, and the individuals. And so I just love that these long relationships go on, and that I feel like they're very reciprocal, and so that we all are trying to help each other all the time go forward, and whether it's our scholarly journeys or our artistic journeys, or community priorities, and everybody's really learning from each other all the time. And so I really appreciate the way that Evelyn and Luann got us started here.
Thank you. So I wanted to start just because we have these two bigger projects that are frames of reference a bit in the conversation. So Katie, could you share just a little bit more about the gallery in the space in the New Burke and how that came to be?
Sure. So the New Burke Museum opened almost exactly a year ago. Right now, we were celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day a year ago at the Burke Museum. And just a few days before that, we opened the Northwest Native Art Gallery at the Burke Museum. And so we had a brand new building and a chance to have a brand new gallery. And so when I was thinking about that gallery, I knew that it definitely needed to be curated by community members, that I could work as a facilitator, that we would all curate together. I also had a vision that I wanted to invite women from the Northwest Coast. And the reason for that was that Northwest Coast art has always been heavily dominated and interpreted by usually male anthropologists or art historians. And it has really been dominated by a focus on carving and sculpture and painting. And these women are incredibly knowledgeable experts, not only on their own artistic practice, but really on the artistic heritage of their communities. And that would include carving and painting and sculpture, but also the textile arts, weaving, applique, basketry, all of these things that have gotten slightly marginalized in the history of Northwest Coast. And so, well, artists have often been invited to participate in curation. It's lots of times it's really either they're curating their own work or they're curating all the work that's the kind of work that they do. But I knew that the people we were going to invite really had a very broad understanding of artistic heritage in their communities. And we know that women are often the ones who are carrying a lot of the oral histories, that are carrying the cultural practices, that are really teaching those to the next generation in concert with the men in their communities as well. And so that was sort of the starting point. And then there were a few other moments. And that was that when you're moving quickly, and unfortunately museum timelines are sometimes quick, it is a hard time to build brand new relationships. And we were building a brand new museum from scratch. So I thought that perhaps the best way to do this was to start with women who had come and been a part of the Bill Holm Center grant program. They already knew the institution, they knew me, they knew the collections. So there are 10,000 pieces of cultural creations from the Northwest Coast in the Burke's collections. And so rather than be overwhelmed by 10,000, I was hoping that people who had been here on research grants or done research in the collections would already have a sense of where to start. And so we all came together, the 6 of us, and I will mention it was Luann and Evelyn, Ryan Feddersen, Betty Pascoe, Allison Bremner, and Pat Courtney Gold. And so we came together and we had a first meeting. We talked about what do museums do well, what do they do badly, what would you like to see in the collections. We had a nice long days meeting. And one of the things that came out of that was this question of, what do you want the public to know? What do you want the public to know about your artistic heritage? And so each of these co-curators took their own path through that. They came up with their own messages and curated each a section of the exhibit. And so that was a little bit of the beginning of how we came together. And then each of the curators came back and went through the collections and chose the pieces they wanted, wrote up the interpretations, added historical photographs and other additional materials. And we're all very gracious about the fact that you don't always get everything you want, that there's sometimes the cases are smaller, sometimes the tech is not what we were hoping we could put in. But everybody really came together, and I'm very proud and happy about the gallery and how it's come out.
Great, thanks. Luann and Evelyn, I'd love to hear more about your participation in this process, and in particular, you know, what led you to say yes to this, other than Luann, you mentioned when Katie calls, you say yes, but what led you say yes to this particular experience, and what was your vision when you were thinking of becoming a part of it?
Well, I was really excited about just some initial discussions that I had with Katie, and how open it was. The possibilities were so open. If it had been more confined to a certain topic or a certain vision, I probably would have got on board as well, but it was really exciting to know that there was just this big open opportunity. And because I had been thinking, and I was actually on the advisory committee for the Indigenous Advisory Committee for the Royal BC Museum at that time. So I was already starting to have all these discussions about museums and what could be done differently. And I had a big long list of ideas in my head. So, but I think it was when we got together for that day was when it finally gelled in my own mind, talking with the other co-curators and having just this really relaxing, sitting around having lunch kind of conversation. And I think Katie at one point had said, but what would you if you could do anything, what would you, and what did museums not do well? And I said, well, they don't do a very good job of telling how, we are families, we do have kids, and it's as though we don't have any children that we've never reproduced or something like that. And I was being kind of cheeky about it. And then I realized that's actually, yeah, that's what it should be. So I really appreciated Katie encouraging me along that path, because it really meant a lot to me. I have a lot of nieces and nephews, and fuss over them all of them when they were babies, making sure they had their first regalia. And that's what really kept me in my practice. But also seeing what a difference it made to them in their young lives, that when they got their names and when they came out in ceremony and got to wear that first regalia I made for them, you could see that they were connecting with their identity so quickly. And I wanted everyone to know how beautiful and magical and important that was, because then I knew that as an auntie, I had done part of the work that every family member has to support our kids and to make them strong in our cultural ways, and especially to know who they are, where they come from, and that they have a right to be here and they matter. So all of that, I think, is what fueled everything that I talked about. And the little button blanket, which was actually an embroidered blanket. And I made an embroidered blanket because I started to realize after I designed it all for buttons, and I thought, if this was really a baby's blanket, you wouldn't want buttons on it because they'd grab it and they'd chew it and they'd swallow all the buttons. So, but they couldn't do that if I embroidered it. So I had to teach myself how to embroider. And I thought, this is a great challenge for me as an artist, to push myself well beyond any boundary I've ever had around my textiles work, and follow through with something that was really new and exciting. And since then, I've done the layout for a couple of more embroidered blankets and some aprons for our elders as well. So I was really excited about being part of it. And then on the day that we opened the exhibit, my mom and my sister came with me. And that was really exciting because they've been the ones, along with my other sisters and my brother, who've really encouraged me on my artistic practice and to stay true to my practice and continue doing what I'm doing. So this was a whole new experience that was really, life-changing for me. And it's changed the way I do my work now at the museum as well.
Thank you.
Well, I wanted to emphasize the continuum of the regalia and the things that we wear in our ceremonies. And so the Burke has a wonderful collection. So there was lots to choose from. And like Katie said, we had to be flexible, because I was like, we were brainstorming at first when we met that one afternoon when we sat around and just had that free reign to really think, and just brainstorm it all. And so I thought it was important. There's the message that we are still here, that we are evolving. And so with the textiles, there's wonderful old examples there in the collection. And there's also, they've been collecting contemporary pieces. So there's a wonderful collection of contemporary pieces. So I wanted to piece this into a continuum of how these garments were so important then and how they are still so important now. And one of the things that I chose to help tell that story was carving, like the carvers with the argillite and even the wood carving. They would carve the details of the regalia into these into their sculpture. So I chose a few of those sculptural depictions of how our garments were worn in the past and used culturally, and how that story has continued and changed. And so it was exciting to, with the restrictions of objects, to tell that story. So it was a challenge in that respect, but I rose to the occasion, and I really enjoyed that evening a year ago. I had quick, because I had broke my foot, so I went down and I was late, and then I had to leave early, and so I really didn't get to really, be able to enjoy that camaraderie, like the you're saying about the canoe, is like, I miss that. And so it was my foot, and I know another time I will hopefully be able to enjoy that kind of camaraderie. But I really enjoyed each one of us got to speak during the opening, and I was so impressed with and learned so much from everybody talking about their journey through this co-curation that was happening. And that was a wonderful evening that we could share. And I really enjoyed that evening, and I really regret having to rush out of there. But just working with the women and the artists that I got to work with really expanded my understanding of their particular expertise and interest. And so I really enjoyed the experience. And I thank Katie, and Bridget, and all of the support that they gave us, and so kindly told me, no, you can't have that. It's already been spoken of. And so, yeah, I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Lauren, I wanted to jump in with one more thing, since this series really focuses on, the title is Curating in Conversation. And one thing I want to stress is that there are details about these kinds of collaborative projects that often don't get talked about. Evelyn's saying, well, there were moments where I didn't get to do what I wanted to do. That's really important to talk about those things. Additionally, the budget is really important to talk about. So when we started this, we knew before we started that the budget we had to write and ask for, either through the museum or through grants, had to include travel for all of these women, a contract to pay them for all of their time, not just the first meeting, but the times that they are coming to the museum, not just travel, but the time at home spent on curating, choosing those objects, writing their narratives, consulting with us, compromising with us, travel to come back for the opening, and all of the things that go into that, as well as paying an honorarium to each contemporary artist whose piece shows up in the gallery. And that is something that I think happens in Canada under a regulation called CARFAC, but is not necessarily regular practice in United States museums. And so all of those things, it's way before anyone comes and steps foot in the museum, the budget really needs to include a number of those things. And I'd like to see that kind of practice and more, I'd really love to pay people more, become regular part of budgeting in the museums, just like PR for the show and the pieces you put up on the side of the bus, or whatever that is. These things also need to be part of those budgets.
Katie, I'm curious, so the process of collaboratively curating this, did you realize your vision with it? And was there anything different than you anticipated significantly?
I think my vision was that we would all come together and have these conversations, and that my hope was that people would get to realize what they had in mind for it. I have a great faith in people, and so I really believe that when you bring good people together, you're gonna get a good product. So I didn't really have in my head a vision of like what the gallery would look like. I knew that it would be sort of sectional, because I knew that people would we wouldn't be able to coordinate entirely, that everybody would need to have their own sort of autonomous section, that I thought that was really important so that people could have their own voices and have as much decision-making process as possible. But I could never have anticipated how beautiful I find it to be because of the things that everybody chose. And the resonances between the conversations that everybody picked out, even though they're from, so these 6 co-curators are from all across the coast and Eastern Washington. They represent really 6 different kinds of artistic practices. And they represent sort of 6 different generations. They start in the, you know, late 20s, 30s, all the way up to our more senior curators. And so I didn't have a vision of what it would look like, but I had a vision of the process, and I felt really happy with how that came through. But the main part is, I think when you bring good people together, you get really good results. And everybody, I was so impressed with how collaboratively everybody works, how supportive everyone is. And I think that's just been such a great honor.
Luann and Evelyn, I'm so interested in, you know, in your experiences as practicing artists and also curators. And I'm curious about how you would articulate your, like how your experiences practicing art affected your curatorial style, and if there are ways in which your curatorial experience have in turn affected your artistic practice.
Good question. Just before this all happened, I had a couple years before completed my BFA at Emily Carr University. And there I had an opportunity to dabble a little bit in curatorial work, and curated each year the Aboriginal student exhibit, which put me in a whole other place in my mind than my practice. And but at the same time, I also used to coordinate and organize all kinds of different cultural gatherings and events. So I was trying to pull the best out of all of that into this experience. I think that part of what I wanted to do was to create in my space enough diversity of the cultural treasures that would tell as broad a story as possible about what my thoughts were around museums representing and talking about us as families and having children and babies, and how important we treated our children. And I think that because the Burke had the different pieces, so there was a little bit of back and forth when I went through the online catalog or the collection. And I probably had twice as many pieces picked as well, but I went through again myself and said, okay, that's not going to tell the story that I want to tell. So I think that all went really smoothly from that side. But you're right, afterwards, and now working at the museum in Victoria, it's really changed how I think about the way I present my art. I don't know yet if it's changing or influencing what I choose to make, what materials I choose to use, because I'm always interested in trying new materials. I mean, I was just telling a friend about an hour ago that I went out for a drive, but I came back from the art store with $300 worth of more supplies that I didn't need. But I saw some really neat materials I hadn't used before. So I think that if anything, it probably validated how I was feeling about experimenting with new things, and made me feel like, yeah, that was successful. I felt good about it. I didn't have any feelings afterwards like, oh, I wish I would have done this instead. I felt really good about it, and mostly because of all of that camaraderie, of all that sisterhood, all of us standing together, each sharing really incredible stories, and all those stories still somehow managed, even though they came from different places, different generations, they all still gelled together really beautifully. So that made me feel like, okay, all of this is on the right track.
Well, in my presentation, I in my art, I started out as a professional watercolor artist, and spent quite a few years being a visual, or the two-dimensional, or the paintings. And so in my research, I discovered there was a watercolor artist along the coast in 1793. So then I was able to go and study his paintings, and then knew that I wanted his paintings to be part of the story, because he painted 8 Haida portraits. And so there was our picture of some of the early garments along our coast. And so in that respect, I kind of pulled the knowledge that I had with how this particular painter in 1793 painted these garments, and what techniques, in watercolor techniques, and I know those techniques. And so in studying his paintings, the knowledge of how I know how to weave the textiles, and I know how to paint the watercolor. And so studying his watercolors, I brought both of those skills, artistic skills, to trying to tell this story, and to pull the old paintings in to be part of that visual story. So in this exhibit, curating it and figuring what can tell the story, I did, and I was able to pull the knowledge as a watercolor artist into this curating of this of my section. And so I'm a painter and a weaver, but right now I'm spending all my time weaving, and I paint for gifts. So and now I'm writing, so my time is really put around
many different directions.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So one of the things I think that really struck me about working with the volume was just, of course, the significance of the communities and the community engagement that, as artists, and curators, you're a link between the communities and the museum. So I'm curious, for all 3 of you, how did the co-curation experience affect your the relationship between your community and the Burke, or the way that your artistic heritage as linked to your community was represented in the space of the Burke?
Katie.
And for Katie, I'm curious too about how your sense of the relationship of the Burke and the communities that the artist came from was, transformed or solidified, or what the kind of, how you would characterize that.
Well, it's interesting. I think that, there's no community voice, right? There's always individuals, and you can try as hard as you can, and there's always going to be lots of different opinions. And so what I enjoy at the Burke is that we have, because of the grant program and also just a history of long open access of our collections, we have lots of different people from the same communities who come in to work with the collections, and we hear lots of different kinds of information and opinions. They don't always agree. People give us conflicting information sometimes about the history of certain creations. Other times we get lots of reinforcement. And but one of the things I think we learn from that is that it's really important to provide those platforms for individuals to have a chance to engage with the collections and then share that with the public. And so all of the cultural curators at the Burke, we all agree very strongly that as often as possible, that institutional voice doesn't really need to be a public voice, that we really want to be a platform for people to speak directly about the creations from their own communities. So that can happen through the curating, as in this case, where all the text in the exhibit comes directly from our curators here. Or even on things like Facebook posts, we try really hard to get words directly from the artists themselves or from members of that community. And we try to veer away from that what has forever been sort of the big authoritative community or institutional voice that often has told stories on behalf of, if you can say that, Native communities, and that hasn't maybe been the most effective. And it also leads to a really big flattening of the individual voices, and can lead to misinterpretations. So I think for me, the great benefit of working at the Burke is that we do have so many people coming into collections, and that I just get a chance to hear so many of those voices, and that we try and put those out for the public as directly as we can.
Okay, I'll jump in with, I think that, yeah, thanks for framing that, so because that felt like a really big question. Especially because, you know, we often will say, I don't represent my whole community. The best I can do with permission is to represent my family, and that would be with their backing, and they would stand with me. And in this instance, you know, my mom and my sister were there. I think that as far as intent, what I was really hoping for out of this process, and I think that I won't know fully until COVID is done and I can actually connect back with community again, was I was so glad that this was set up to encourage women's voices to be heard, and the way we do things to be seen. Because, you know, you're right, what was said earlier, this opportunities like this aren't always available to Indigenous women. And I really wanted for my nieces and my nephews, but also other young girls in the community to see this and hear about it and know about it and want to visit and say, wow, so I could do that. And just to inspire them. And I felt like, you know, going to art school and a lot of the advocacy work I do in the community for our artists is a big part of it, is advocating for more recognition of women in the arts. And one of the ideas I've been toying with, and I talked with Katie about it a couple times, I've got a list of 12 things I want to do my graduate studies in. And one of them is sifting through museum collections, especially things that are unattributed, and analyzing whether or not I think those pieces were made by women. Because they're unattributed. I think that, you know, I've looked at some of the styles of different pieces, especially carvings, and especially when I studied my grandmother's works, and there were these really tiny little nuances that I saw in her carving, and she taught my dad and my uncles and several other young men in the community, and you can see her influence in their work, but you can also see the way she designs differently, and it's really hard to describe. So what I hope is that more young Indigenous women will look at that, think critically about it, question what's in front of them, what's been put in front of them by people who are usually outside of our communities, and challenge it and present something different. So, and I think that all that will do is just broaden this great understanding of the history of our art and its meaning to us now. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
When I was thinking through my section, I'm talking about the textiles and the garments. And when the northern people, the Tlinkits, the Haidas, and the Tsimshians are the ones who wove the Nahin robe and the Raven's Tail robe. And so I was happy that the other curators had chosen a few textiles, because the northern people are all part of that story. But for me, in my research, I try to stay in my lane as far as Haida. And so, and I don't want to speak about or for another group of people. So as when I was co-curating this section of mine, I wanted to like I say, stay in what I know, because I just don't want to assume anything about cultural use from the other people. And so I tried real hard to stay within that community, but still tell a whole story of the Northwest Coast continuum of ceremony and of the ceremonial garments. So in that respect, the Burke had a few pieces made in contemporary by people here in Masset. So I was able to pull a few pieces from artists that are alive here and now and are contemporary, and that contributed to this story of mine. So in that fact of community, I wanted to stay with what I know, and so that's what kept me choosing pieces that were within my culture. Even though I was trying to tell a bigger story, I still didn't want to go beyond my area of expertise.
Thank you.
I guess I would jump in with one more thing that came to mind as Evelyn was talking. The invitation to all of these co-curators was really because of their expertise sort of as historians. And of course, the insight that being practicing artists has given to them, and that they were going to each create, you know, their theme and their section of the exhibit. And then fortunately, we were able to bring together enough funds to offer the option that everybody would make something new or bring something that they had made to the Burke to be a part of their section. And so Evelyn had a piece that she had previously made, this amazing canoe cape that fit right in with the conversations she was having. And most of the other curators made brand new pieces that really came out of that moment of thinking through all of these pieces. And particularly Betty Pascoe, who's a Suquamish weaver, she had chosen pieces from the collection beyond the Suquamish and Salish cultural areas, but pieces that had iconography, symbols, motifs that she felt really told a story. And then she went home and wove a brand new piece with all of those motifs from the other pieces in her section. And there was an exhibit a number of years ago that I wanted to call Conversations with Collections. That didn't end up being the title of the exhibit, but that moment just epitomized this incredible process that I see where people are having an artistic conversation with the previous generations of artists and of their creations that comes through in their new pieces. And so it's one of the most important things about museums continuing to collect contemporary art, not just because it's exciting and it's new, but because it's really part of this continuum. And then we know that, 30 years from now, the next generation is going to come in and they're going to be studying what we did now. What did we do during COVID? What were our artists making then? So that was a really exciting part of this process as well. And I want people, when they come to the Burke, to really look for those pieces because they're quite phenomenal.
Thank you. One of the things that I think has been, emerging as a theme of this conversation, but also so clear from the work that in terms of all of your participation in this and then also in the book, is the significance of women artists and how gender works within the context of Northwest Coast art, but even more broadly. And so I was curious, I wanted to hear more about what's your sense of how issues of gender are playing out in terms of producing art, in terms of the commercial market, and in terms of the critical recognition of artists, and what you think, how do you see that looking now versus like at maybe another time in your lives, and how also, what do you think needs to happen to make the, a situation equitable for women artists and other, and other folks who are not sort of male?
I want to throw that one to the two artists themselves, and particularly Evelyn. You know, I know in the commercial market, the number of hours that goes into something that you make. You know, when you spend 18 months or 2 years weaving a robe versus, you know, how long it takes to carve a mask or a totem pole. I think it'd be interesting to hear your take on that.
Well, I know that both my daughters weave, and they have done trades with carvers. And so the carvers whip up a bentwood box. You know, it takes, you know, a while, and it'll take longer if they carved it. But there was a few trades that were not carved boxes. They were bent and painted. And other trades that I've seen my daughters do. And it's so like, this is not fair. I know how long my daughter worked on that headband. I know how long she worked on those leggings, you know. And so oftentimes, you know, I think that people don't really acknowledge how long our weaving takes. You know, like looking at a robe, it's like actually looking at a huge giant basket. And because it's so geometric and so bilateral and so conventionalized, it's like, yes, we want to do contemporary things, but we are tied down to our traditional techniques, and those take time. And so, yeah, you see the carvers able to get huge money commissions for their work, and I think that's why I think it's so important to get this information out to the people who collect, the people who are interested in our art, so that they can continue to or to appreciate the time and the techniques more fully by showing the textile story. Yeah, it takes time, and it can be kind of a discouraging thing when you see things that don't seem fair because we are women, and sometimes our art is considered craft, and we do have craft. We have to accomplish and be the best at our craft in order to rise up to be to have this art, and it is an art. But so it is anchored in craft and technique, but we all work towards making it high art. And I was just really pleased that the Boston Museum of Fine Arts recently collected a robe of mine, and it's now in their collection, and that I've recently had the Burke collect. But for the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, it's not a archaeology, anthropology, natural, you know, it's reaching up to the art collections, and I'm very pleased with that for myself as well as for the whole genre of textiles.
Mm-hmm. I'm seeing a real difference just from when I first started wanting to carve in high school, and I talked about this in the book, and how I was really discouraged by some of my classmates, male classmates, who told me that girls weren't supposed to carve. But even at that time, women were carving, and I didn't know about my grandmother, and you know, went on about that in the story. But about somewhere in the last year, I got a message from an organization that wanted to commission a totem pole to be carved, and they really wanted it to be carved by a woman. So I went across social media and said, everybody tell me if you know of any women carvers, send me their names or send me a private message. And I think I ended up with, it was almost 30 names, 30 women carvers. And I was so thrilled to see that. And I thought, that is excellent. So that I think is important. What troubled me though was, even though, and I looked at all those names and I thought, yeah, I know of some of these women and they're awesome, but that's some of these names I've never even heard of. And why is that? And I frequent galleries, I go to exhibits, and I do my best to keep up to date in the art world. And why have I not heard of them? So are they carving but not getting the opportunities? Do they never hear about calls such as these? Where's the gap? And so I put all those notes into my advocacy work, but I really looked at it and thought, it's, just in my lifetime to realize that we've gone from being told we can't by our own relatives, to being told throughout the years, maybe you could dabble in it, but even when I started to hear encouragement for getting into carving, then I would hear from galleries, or I'd stop by different shops and say, if I were to bring a mask in, would you consider buying it from me? And they're like, oh no, we don't buy from women carvers because you're not carvers. And they had their own narrative that really irked me. So it was, so that's changing as well. So I'm really glad to see it, but I realized that, I'm getting to be a little old lady, and it's taken my whole lifetime of, pursuing this and watching this and bothering people about it and saying, why wouldn't you give a woman a chance? Why wouldn't there be that opportunity? What is it that's so different, and why do you believe that? And so just challenging all of that and seeing changes starting to happen. And I think that, it's exhibits like what we're seeing here at the Burke. It's other museums, other galleries, also taking that recognition and hearing from, and probably taking the lead from exhibits like, the Northwest Coast Hall, being able to say, wow, we've never done an exhibit like that either, and sort of getting on board with the idea. So I think it's rippling out really nicely. Of course, nothing ever happens fast enough for me, but it's happening. And I really, I'm looking forward to seeing the day where one of my nieces, who started really early, her dad's a carver, and she started designing really young. I would love to see her work in an exhibit someday. I want to be present when that happens.
Luann, I know that maybe soon that we'll move into the question and answer, but this question just came up that's so right exactly what you're talking about, that I thought I'd just give you a chance to add a little on the end to address one of our attendees, who says that she's an unnamed Tsimshian artist and her journey is identity right now. She was a 60s scoop baby, sorry, she said the 60s scoop babies are now grandmothers, as she is. But she's looking for encouragement to go back to university and is interested in carving. Are there places that you would recommend?
I don't personally know of university programs. I had this great debate when I was attending Emily Carr, because I wondered why, when I arrived, they didn't have all my programs I wanted. They're starting to get better at that. I would encourage her to check with local friendship centers and not-for-profits and community arts groups, and a mentor, a direct mentor. And depending on where she lives, if she's in Canada, there are grants available to help her, like through the First Peoples Cultural Council, to pay a mentor to teach her one-on-one. So look for those opportunities, because if you go into an academic setting, you may end up learning much more broadly, which will, I think, take you longer. And if you want to get into your heritage and learn your style, because you can't just learn to carve, you're learning about your family, your lineage, all of those things are interconnected. So it's not just that surface aesthetic of learning how to use a knife on a piece of wood. It's so much richer than that. And she'll get more out of it if she is able to do a mentorship.
And also up in Kisan, there is the Frida Deasing
That's right.
And it's named after Frida because she was a wonderful carver, and it even taught Dempsey Bob and Stan Bevan. You know, they really attribute a lot of their early inspiration and teaching from Frida. So, that would be a great place if you could make it too, up into the Kazan area. And I'd like to mention that in my weaving, I teach men, and one of my best apprentices, and now he's a standalone weaver, is a man, Hands. And so I think that we are into the area where we can drop our things that hold us back, that don't have to hold us back. And so I do open up my classes to men.
We're going to turn to the Q&A soon, but I had one question, since we haven't talked so much about the book yet, but both you, Luann, and Evelyn have referred to writing in different ways, you know, through the telling a story through the objects that you in the curatorial experience, as well as the writing that you completed for the book. And I'd love to hear more about, we talked a little bit before about, you know, your role as an artist in relationship to your role as a curator. How did that transform further into your role as an essayist? How did you experience that, or what challenges did you face in communicating your vision then through words?
Oh, I was just, was it Ashley who did all my editing? I was so happy there was an editor. I think that it was a big challenge to do that switch, and we're changing hats all the time. And so storytelling and then having to write that down was a big challenge. And for me, what I've been grappling with on the academic side for a few years since attending university is this idea of understanding our own methodologies and our own way of conveying history. And because it's from this oral tradition, so many of my citations came from our family oral history. And so I depended on that mostly to tell this story about my grandmother and her journey. And because you know, she was left out of all the history books, so I couldn't cite anybody else talking about her. There was one book, and so it was really challenging that way, especially for the message I wanted to tell. But I found that it was also very rewarding in that respect, because as afraid as I felt to say, you know, mostly what I'm going to talk about comes from my aunties and uncles and all the times that I was doing my research and asking them a million questions. And that's what I have to rely on. I had my own notes, my own memories, and knowing that in our oral tradition, if I'm going to ask a question, then I have to be prepared to remember what I was told. And that doesn't fit neatly into the academic world. And there was even a point where I thought, oh my God, am I going to have to go through all my boxes of, I'm a real paper hoarder. Am I going to have to go through all my boxes and find my notes from 1981 that I wrote on the booklets that I was carrying around back then? And I knew I had them, but I thought, I don't know if I can find them. And then is that going to make a big difference? So I think it was a really interesting journey to consider how can I challenge that further? And I see other people doing it in academia, Indigenous people challenging that status quo of the absolute scholarly format that you have to follow, and following instead an oral tradition. So it was validating in that way, but also really mentally and intellectually exhausting.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, during the time I was studying at the Burke Museum, awarded that study grant. I was also wanted to know a lot about like Swan's notes, and so I got a few notes from Swan and his visit here in 1883, handwritten copies of handwritten notes of Swan's, James Swan's, and I also got some handwritten notes or copies of notes of Viola Garfield. And so she'd been up in Ketchikan when they were doing the, bringing the totem poles over to the Ketchikan Totem Heritage Center, and that was in 1940. Was it 1940 that she was interviewing a few of those carvers. And so so I got privy to these unpublished notes. And so I was afraid too that it was like unpublished notes, like anyway, and I couldn't, with unpublished notes, you can't figure the page numbers even. So, but I was fortunate to have those primary sources. Again, I'm really into primary sources. Sure, I'll read other people's opinion, but I'd rather read the primary sources. And so it was close to the time where I was studying at the Beinecke Library at the Yale in New Haven, Connecticut. And so I had known I was going to have to, or not have to, but I had the honor to write this essay. And so all the time I was looking at these primary sources and then having the copies of the primary source notes, I was able to put together some interesting things that I felt had not really been out there that much in respect to our designs and our patterns, and how they gained power and how they gained the belief in the power of our garments. And so it just the timing of my research, and it really dovetailed quite nicely with the essay, and I was really happy to contribute to that book.
Great.
And I want to give a shout out actually to University of Washington Press, because I think that you are very much on the forefront of thinking about being accepting, encouraging, supporting of Indigenous knowledge, and the way that gets transmitted, the way where the authority comes from, how that works in academic publishing. And those doors have been closed for a long time. And I think the press is very forward thinking in supporting all of that, and how new kinds of publications can be better platforms for Indigenous knowledge, and where that comes from, all the way down to things about how we formatted Indigenous language terms in the book. And also questions of not always having to have everything in an edited volume be entirely consistent, that you could let those individual voices come through in certain ways that didn't have to get flattened by editorial rules. So I appreciate that, Lauren.
Thank you. It's been an honor to work in this field. I've learned a ton, and it's interesting to think about how, just like museums, how incorporating Indigenous perspectives and knowledge transforms our ideas of what publishing might mean as well. So it is kind of, a very generative sort of merging of interests, and sort of helps us rethink a lot of things. So I think we're at this point where we should turn to Q&A, or we're going to run out of time to answer people's questions. So
I think we have 10 minutes left. Is that right, Lauren?
Yeah, maybe 10, 15, something like that.
I think.
Yes. So so we have a few, and I'm gonna maybe start from the top. So this is Jill says, thank you for this wonderful conversation. What would you like to see change in museums, especially now, and what can museum professionals do to support these changes?
Wow. Everyone has such great, lovely, big questions. I personally would like to see a lot more first of all, a more open door for museum professionals to come out to the communities, to our communities, get to know us a little better, because most museums, and I know this from our own museum, the mandate is around collecting and representing a certain region's history. And we have to grapple with that difficult history of many of the things that are currently in collections aren't there by free will. So we have to, if we're going to talk about reconciliation, which is a big discussion going on in all of our communities right now, we have to talk about addressing that initial relationship first. We have to clear that away. All of our people have ceremonies that lift away some of that embarrassment or shame or difficulty. And I think that museums could really benefit from learning about that and putting that into their practice around talking with us. And then look at collaborating with us on how we want to be represented in your museum. We have stories to tell. We can tell those stories. We can tell you a lot more about those objects. I call them, well, they're art. So we could tell you a lot more about that art that would really educate the public more fully. I'll stop there because I could go on for 4 hours about that one.
Evelyn, do you have anything to add?
No, just that I just remember many, many years ago when Robin Wright was researching her Northern Haida Carver book, and how she actually came here to Haida and lived in the village for, I don't know, more than a month. It was a long time that she came. She rented a place and she was here with us. And so she didn't just depend on primary sources or her academic research. She came to our place and actually lived there with us. And I think that we very much appreciate that when people come here and ask us, I read this, but what do you say about what I read and what I'm thinking, and so you get closer to the truth when you get closer to our community, like Luann said.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, as Luann was talking about, there's a lot of hesitation sometimes for people from Indigenous communities to come into museums, because for a long time they haven't been friendly places. There's been gatekeeping. There's just also a lot of trauma about, well, it's wonderful to visit with the ancestors and their creations in collections. It's also can be very exhausting and emotional. And I know that the Royal British Columbia Museum does a great job of sending out teams to community celebrations, to Indigenous gatherings at friendship centers and other places around Victoria, and the Museum of Anthropology at UBC. They also send their teams up to potlatches and share pieces from their collections that maybe they're not ready to be repatriated, or that conversation hasn't happened, but they are on loan for those ceremonies that they need to be. And so I think museums, particularly across the US, can learn that lesson, that when something needs to go back to community, that they are great caretakers, and that of course that is the thing that you should support, above everything else. And at the Bill Holm Center, we also know, like, we have these artist grants, and lots of practicing artists who are familiar with writing grants, that's easy for them. But if you don't think of yourself as an artist, you're a maker, or you haven't ever written a grant, it can be intimidating to apply. And so we try to send our team out to gatherings and let them know what those things look like, but then also have opportunities that if a master artist wants to teach a workshop, bring people from community to the Burke and work with collections there, that's great. But also to choose a few pieces from collections that our staff will take back to community, and they can run that workshop there. And then, then people who haven't been to the museum or just can't travel for some reason have a chance to share in the older pieces from collection, make connections with museum personnel, and then And then it's not so scary to call up and say, I want to come, can you open the doors for me? Because I think that oftentimes the average person doesn't think that the doors will be open for them, but they are.
We have another question from Ardith that says, thank you for this. It is helping me to formulate my thoughts. I have been dabbling with an idea of doing something with my late grandmother's baskets. This was the way she supported herself, and I am interested in weaving her very hard story through her baskets. An interesting facet is that all of the children and grandchildren share stories of her baskets. They weave the family together. And Ardith is wondering about advice on next steps to go somewhere with this concept.
That's a big question.
That's another big one. I used to travel around the province doing artist workshops on how to apply for grants. And it sounds to me like something that would be a great emerging, working through, there's several levels of grants, being able to do that, to bring people together, cover off the cost of travel if different family members live far away. And even bringing in guest presenters. Different grants have provide you with the ability to bring in resource people as well, and to offer them travel money and an honoraria. So it sounds like something that would be a great exploration under one of the emerging grants. Or, you know, if someone in the family is really well versed and experienced and is a practicing professional, there might be a higher level of grant that they could access as well. I always encourage people to go, you know, always go from emerging to practicing to professional, because once you, even though the grants might be higher dollars at those professional levels, you can't go back to emerging if you declare yourself. So just, you know, follow that trajectory and make use of the resources that are available to you.
I think we have time for one more question. So this is from Charlotte, who says, great conversation. Pleco, thank you to all of you. Luann and Evelyn, I raise my hands to you for challenging patriarchy in the Indigenous art world and paving the way for our up and coming Indigenous female artists. What advice would you give to these young women as they start their artistic journey?
Go, Evelyn.
I'd say learn the basics, learn your techniques of what direction you're interested in, be it carving or weaving, that you learn the basic techniques of your ancestors, but that you give yourself freedom to have fun with colors and have fun with new tools. I would say as quickly as you can, come up with your own project and make sure that project pushes your boundaries. Go bigger than you thought you could go. I know the first big project, I learned Raven's Tail with a 2x2 inch 2-day workshop at the Seattle Art Museum with Cheryl Samuel. And then my very next project was Raven's Tail that completely surrounded a big full-size button robe. And so that I jumped right into it, from the 2-inch to this big robe. And so, boy, that gave me so much confidence. It's, you know, learn your basics, really make sure you know your techniques, but really right away, push your boundaries, push yourself to go big.
That's exactly what I would say. That's, yeah, and the same thing, started small, went really big on the next one, and knocked it back a couple of notches so I could practice, because I wasn't confident holding a brush and running it across a page. I didn't know if I could take a brush and run it across wood the same way. So trying out different materials, don't be afraid to do that. And don't let anyone tell you can't. That's been the one that I've been up against my whole life, is hearing people say you can't do that, which just made me want to do it even more. So follow your heart, and yes, learn your basics.
And as a historian, I would say, just immerse yourself in all of those pieces that came before you. It doesn't mean that what you make has to look like any of those. And we have artists who participate in, performance art and installation and glass and all kinds of very cutting edge materials and techniques. And they really find it fascinating and helpful to look at those old historical pieces, both for aesthetics, for the freedom to use different materials, and also because artists are always answering the questions of what's important right then. And the historical things, we're answering those questions. And a lot of those questions stick in our lives over generations and generations. So just immerse yourself, whether it's through the images in books or the images online, or if you have a chance, come to the museum and ask to look at the collections. You can't be too young or too new to look at the older pieces.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of you, to the panelists for your wonderful conversation and insights. Thank you so much to Bridget for your behind the scenes support, and thank you to everyone who could join us tonight. I really appreciate it, and I wish you a good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you, Luann.